Good morning and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Future of Asia Conference. I'm Terry McCarthy, I run the council. Delighted to see some of you coming back from last night, and for those of you who are just arriving, welcome to our conference. As we all know, Los Angeles is the most Asia-connected city in the United States, which is why we're doing a conference here. We all understand how closely linked our futures are to Asia. We are ourselves planning to make this an annual conference, so we hope to see many of you back next year, because Asia and the United States are going to continue to have a relationship for the ongoing future. As we discussed last night, the basic inspiration for this conference is this enormous growth in Asia, the fact that the Asian middle class will be 2/3 of the entire world's middle class by 2030. So today, our panels are going to dig deep into the various consequences of that unprecedented growth, both positive and some more challenging. We'll look at individual countries, Japan, India, China, Korea. We'll look at industries, healthcare. We'll look at K-pop. We'll look at the defense industry and the future of cars. So there are a whole bunch of things that are involved in this enormous growth in Asia. But we thought we'd start the day with some hard figures, polling figures on Asia compiled by the Pew Research Center, which is sort of the gold standard for international polling, as I'm sure you know. And after that, we'll have a series of breakout sessions, both in this room, which is the Starlight Ballroom, in the Wedgwood Ballroom, which is just across the way here, and also downstairs in Wilshire 1, which you'll see the stairs as you go out, just take you down. It's basically down here. But now let me ask Richard Wike, who is the Director of Global Attitudes of the Pew Research Center, to come up and talk a little bit about how Asians view the US and how Asians view the rest of Asia. Richard.
Great. Thanks so much, Terry, and thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk a little bit about some of the survey work that we do at the Pew Research Center. We're actually expanding our international research efforts over the next 2 or 3 years, and Asia is going to be a big part of those expansion efforts. As we all know, it's a very dynamic region, lots of changes taking place, and part of what we like to do in our survey work is we like to explore how people are reacting to all of these major changes. So what I'll share with you today is some of the data we've collected that I think illustrates how people are reacting to the big economic, social, and geopolitical changes that are having a big impact on the region. So I'll walk through some slides that highlight what I think are some of the key findings from our survey work in Asia over the last couple of years. Before I do, let me first tell you a little bit, though, about the Pew Research Center, so you know a little bit more about who we are and what we do. We are a think tank based in Washington, D.C. We've been around about 20 years now. We're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust. So if you give us the money, you get to name the place. So that's where the name comes from. Any of you want to outbid them? The name's open, I think. We do get money from other foundations as well. We've gotten money from the Gates Foundation, for example, to do some survey work in Africa and other sources too. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy. So we don't take stances on policy debates or political issues. We work really hard to be objective and again, sort of stay out of ideological disputes that happen a lot in Washington, D.C. We actually like to call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank because we put such an emphasis on objective information and empirical research, and that maybe sets us apart from some of the other think tanks that you're probably familiar with. We do all sorts of different research using a lot of different methods, but the cornerstone of it is still survey research. And we do a lot of that kind of work in the United States, looking at public opinion on political issues, social issues, questions around religion and other topics. And the part of the Pew world that I direct is the Global Attitudes Research, which conducts surveys all around the world, looking at a whole host of different issues, how the world sees the United States and China, issues like globalization, democracy, development, climate change, a whole variety of different topics. We've been doing surveys now since 2002, and we've been in 93 different countries around the world. Hopefully, we'll be able to add a couple more countries to that list over the next couple of years. And you can see I've listed the website here, lots of good resources there. If any of you have any questions about our work, I'd be happy to talk with you individually more about what we do and how it might be relevant to the work that you're doing. So let me start off by just talking a little bit about how people are viewing conditions in their own lives and in their countries in Asia. And I'll start off with this slide on life satisfaction. And what this question uses is something called the ladder of life. It's essentially a 0 to 10 scale that survey researchers use to assess how satisfied people are with their lives. So this is data from 28 countries that we surveyed in both 2007 and 2014. And this is the percentage of people in advanced, emerging, and developing nations who rate their lives a 7 or higher on this scale. So this is people who are basically kind of satisfied with their lives. And as you can see, what we found, and this is based on global data from all around the world, is that during this time period, people in developing nations became more satisfied with their lives. The numbers there still aren't as high as what you see in wealthier countries, but there was a real improvement. What you see in emerging nations, the sort of middle-income nations in Asia and elsewhere, was a very dramatic improvement in life satisfaction during this time period. In these middle-income countries, we talked a lot about the growing middle class last night. I think that's part of what's going on there. In these emerging markets, people's incomes are rising. They're more satisfied with their life conditions. Very different pattern in the advanced economies. In the rich countries during this period, we actually saw life satisfaction go down. And of course, that reflects the economic struggles that many people in the richer countries have faced dealing with the Great Recession and its after effects. So, a big surge in terms of people being happier with their lives in emerging markets. A lot of that's taking place in Asia. You can see a somewhat similar pattern here on this scatter plot. If you can see the bottom axis here, what that represents is the change in the average change in GDP per year for this decade of 2005 to 2014. The vertical axis is the percentage of people in these countries who say they think children in their country are going to be better off financially than their parents. So what you can see here is that there's a very strong correlation between these two things. Where there's been economic growth over the last decade or so, people are optimistic about the financial prospects of the next generation. Where there hasn't been very strong growth, there's not much optimism. And if you can make out there up in the upper right, you've got countries like Vietnam, China, India, where there's been strong growth and there's a lot of optimism about the next generation. Japan, on the other hand, is down in the lower left corner, anemic growth, not a lot of optimism. So again, it's a lot of these emerging markets, these middle-income countries, where you're seeing growth, and then you're seeing it have a real impact on public attitudes and public optimism about the future. That growth has also come with some negative side effects, however. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit using some data from China to illustrate the point. This is based on a survey we conducted in China last year, where we asked them to rate the top problems facing their country. And these are the top problems people named. And if you pay attention to the top 4 in particular up there, I think they speak to some broader issues: corruption, air and water pollution, the gap between rich and poor. And to me, what that highlights is that, yes, people are obviously happy to have had the economic growth they've had, but on the one hand, they don't think it's being shared necessarily in a fair manner. The rich are getting richer, some people are getting left behind. Through corruption, some people are able to take advantage of the growth through their political or business connections, again, other people being left behind. And then people are also seeing some real negative consequences of this growth as well, especially its impact on the environment. You know, if you follow China, it's probably not too much of a surprise that we've seen a real surge in concern about both air and water pollution in recent years. And now people put both those things near the top of their list. So, you know, the growth is obviously good, having lots of good impact, but there's some concerns about it as well. And there are concerns about it sort of in the more cultural, sociological realm too. And we've got a couple of slides that I think highlight that. So we asked people, do you like the pace of modern life or do you not like the pace of modern life? And, you know, 2/3 say, yes, I like the pace of modern life. But they also point to some negative sides of it as well. For instance, by a 53 to 34% margin, people say that consumerism and commercialism are a threat to our culture. So there's lots of things about these tremendous changes that have taken place in China that people are embracing, but they see some downsides to it as well. And you can see a couple of other downsides, I think, highlighted with this next slide. People say that their traditional way of life in China is getting lost. Only 29% say their traditional way of life remains strong. And moreover, they see sort of threats to their traditions and their culture from outside. Fully 79% say our way of life needs to be protected against foreign influence. So on the one hand, they're consuming lots of products from abroad, including cultural products, but they're also worried a little bit that it's pushing out their own culture. And we see this same kind of thing around the world. We often see it when we ask about American cultural exports, American movies, music, television. You know, people tell us, you know, yes, I love Hollywood, and, you know, yes, I want my, you know, Jay-Z and my Taylor Swift and all that stuff. But they also worry that they're getting a little bit too much American culture in their lives, and it's displacing their own culture and customs and traditions. So, you know, it's sort of a push-pull effect. People like modernity, they like these new cultural options they have, but they worry about its effect on their own culture and their own traditions. So let me shift a little bit now and talk about some of the geopolitical issues that we look into. And in particular, both around the world and especially in Asia, we like to ask people what they think about the United States and China and the balance of power between these two countries. So this is our kind of baseline question on what the world thinks about the United States. Very simple question. And probably of all the questions we've asked internationally, this is the one that's gotten the most attention for us from the media and policymakers and others, because it's a pretty good barometer on what people are thinking about the U.S. So we asked them, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the United States? And as you can see in the Asian countries that we've surveyed over the last couple of years, we've seen mostly positive reviews for the U.S., especially in the Philippines, 92%. Now, there's been a little tension, as you all know, of late, but certainly among average citizens in the Philippines, very, very high ratings, very positive attitudes towards the U.S. Very high in South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, in most of the countries that we survey in Asia. Even in China, 50% favorable in the most recent survey we conducted there, and that's up a little bit from last year. The exception is Pakistan. Probably no surprise, lots of tensions in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And of all the countries we survey around the world, we see some of the most negative views of the U.S. in Pakistan on a pretty consistent basis. Now, same question about China. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of China? And by and large, mostly favorable marks for China as well, although overall not as high as what we see as when we ask about the U.S. So, very positive ratings for China in Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, in Australia, mostly positive. Even in the Philippines, there's some tensions, obviously, between the two countries, but the public is more positive than negative. One of the things you'll notice on this and other charts is that these numbers don't always add up to 100% because we typically don't show the don't knows. So in India, for example, a lot of people, especially on these geopolitical topics, will say they don't really have an opinion. So that's why these numbers don't add up to 100%. The two countries that really stand out, however, as being negative towards China are Vietnam and Japan. Very negative attitudes towards China and Vietnam, even more negative in Japan. We also asked the Chinese what they think about Japan. 81% had a negative view of Japan, right? So it's sort of a mutual animosity there in terms of public opinion. If you're interested, we just put out a report earlier this week that looks specifically at how the Japanese and Chinese view each other. So I'd be happy to share that with you if you're interested. So mostly good marks for China in Asia, but it varies depending on what country you're talking about. Now, another question we like to ask about China is about its growing military power. And do people think this is a good thing or a bad thing for their country? And as you can see, not a lot of disagreement on this in Japan or South Korea. Overwhelmingly people in those countries say this is a bad thing for our country. Mostly a bad thing in most of the other countries as well, Pakistan being the exception, where you get a majority saying we actually think this is a good thing for our country. But by and large, a lot of concerns in the region about China's growing military might. A little bit different of a picture, however, when you ask about China's economic impact. Is China's growing economy a good thing or a bad thing for our country? And here, you get more positive than negative responses, especially in some countries, Thailand, Bangladesh, Malaysia. Even in Japan, on balance, public opinion says we think China's growing economy is a good thing for our country. As we know, increasing economic ties between the two countries, and that's something that the Japanese public recognizes. So even though on all these other questions we ask about China, a lot of negative sentiments in Japan, when you ask about the economy, the economic relationship, people see that in a positive light. The holdouts here are the Philippines and Vietnam, especially Vietnam. Even on the economic front, they don't necessarily see a good impact from China. There we go. Something else we like to ask about, as I said, is the balance of power between the U.S. and China, in particular, the economic balance of power. So this is a question we've asked a number of times over the years all around the world. Who do you think is the world's leading economic power? And people can say the U.S. or China or the countries of the EU or Japan. Around the world, not many people say it's Japan or it's the EU. They tend to say it's the U.S. or China. And in Asia, what we typically find is people think the U.S. is the world's leading economic power today. That's the majority view in Japan. 54% of Americans think that, which is actually up pretty substantially over the last couple of years as Americans have slowly but surely regained at least some of their economic confidence after the Great Recession. In India, people tend to name the U.S., and in China itself, a plurality say the U.S. is the world's leading economic power, not our country. The exception is Australia, and this is pretty consistent across a lot of questions we ask in Australia. Australia, of course, very positive towards the United States overall, a long-time strong ally of the United States, but also, recognizes the importance of the economic relationship with China. China is Australia's leading trading partner, and you see that reflected a lot in the questions that we ask, including this one in Australia. Here's another balance of power question. It's a little bit different from the previous one in two ways. One is it's about being a superpower, so it's a little bit broader of a concept than just economic power. And two, it's more about the future than about the current situation. So we ask people, do you think China will never replace the U.S. as the world's leading superpower? Or do you think China will, or maybe already has replaced the United States as the world's top superpower? And when we ask this around the world, as you can see, if you look at that global media number, people tend to think the future belongs to China. They tend to think it will overtake the U.S. and become the world's top superpower. And if anything, this view is particularly common among some of America's top allies in Europe. Europeans are especially likely to say this. In Asia, in China's backyard, people are actually a little less likely to hold this view. In Asia, in general, views on this question about whether China will overtake the U.S. are pretty closely divided. They're also closely divided in the United States itself. So Americans aren't sure whether China is going to overtake America at some point in the future either. Now let's look at some specific issues around security, trade, the pivot, which of course we heard Admiral Harris talk about last night. One of the things that comes out in our data is that people are very concerned about territorial disputes with China. If you look at these percentages here, more than 80% in South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam say they're concerned that territorial disputes with China could lead to a military conflict. And it's about 6 in 10 in China itself. So this isn't just a topic for elites. It's something that's very much a concern for average citizens in the region as well. Attitudes towards the military pivot of the United States towards China, towards Asia. We asked people, is it a good thing or a bad thing that the U.S. is committing more military resources to the region? And if you look at the dark green parts of those pie charts there, that's the percentage of people say it's a good thing. So the good generally outweighs the bad, although it's not an overwhelming endorsement in the region towards the U.S. military pivot either. And Americans themselves are divided over this question and over whether we need to commit more military resources to the Asia-Pacific region or not. And that reflects what we've seen a lot in our polls over the years, recently in the United States, which is people are kind of reluctant to engage internationally more so than in the past, and especially when it comes to security issues. Our survey last year found general support for TPP in the region. Obviously, the sort of main part of economic outreach to Asia by the United States, including support for it here in the United States, although I will note that some research my colleagues have done recently shows support in the U.S. slipping, which I think reflects a lot of what you've heard over the last year or so in the U.S. presidential campaign from both parties, and opposition has grown towards TPP in the U.S. And then finally, we also wanted to ask the Chinese, what do they think about American policies in Asia? So we asked them, which comes closer to your view, that the U.S. is trying to keep China from becoming as powerful as it is, or is the U.S. Essentially accepting that China is going to be an equal power at some point? And by nearly 2-to-1 margin, Chinese respondents tell us, we think the U.S. is trying to essentially keep us down, contain us, and prevent China from becoming as powerful as America is. So I think it's a reminder that certainly these issues, the rebalance, the pivot, are viewed very differently in China than they're viewed in the United States and maybe in other parts of Asia as well. And then just a couple of slides on American attitudes towards China, which is something we've looked at a lot in our surveys. In recent years, when you've asked Americans about their concerns regarding China, they've tended to say economic issues. It's been the debt held by China, the trade deficit with China, the perception that we're losing jobs to China. But what we saw in our most recent poll earlier this year is that while it's still true that people think of the economic competition with China, they're increasingly worried about security issues as well. So when we ask them which concerns you more, China's economic or military strength, they still say China's economic strength, but the military number is creeping up. And I think that tells us that these issues like the South China Sea, maybe the cyber issues, these are starting to resonate more, and there's something that the American public is paying more attention to, and they're starting to think about China as a security issue almost as much as an economic issue. And then one thing that's just worth keeping in mind when we talk about American public opinion towards China is that there are significant differences among some groups within the United States. In particular, it's Republicans and it's older people who tend to have more negative views towards China, and especially that sort of conservative base of the Republican Party. And we've heard a lot about China, obviously, during the campaign. We'll maybe hear more about it in the closing weeks of the campaign. And, you know, I think that it is true that when Americans talk about China, on the one hand, it's certainly a foreign policy issue, but it's also an economic issue as well. And when Americans think about China, you know, they're thinking about some issues that pertain specifically to China, but they're also thinking about their own country, the economic challenges we've faced over the last decade or so, and it reflects their own unease about America's place and standing in the world. So I'll stop there. I don't know if there's any time for questions now, or I'm happy to just take them one-on-one. Yeah, so if you have questions, you know, I'll be around all day, and I'm happy to talk more about this set of data or anything else that we do at the Pew Research Center. So thanks very much.